You should stand on a can. I'm serious. So, the thing is, if you take an aluminum can, you drain the contents, and then you stand on the top of it. One of the interesting things about it is that the structure of it is so strong that it can kind of support your weight if you have good enough balance, which is another way of saying that I could never actually do this. But if you have good enough balance, you can stand on a can and it won't actually collapse. Now, this is not a product placement for aluminum can products. And really, the thing that makes this interesting is not the fact that an aluminum can support the weight of a human being, but the fact that if you tap the can on the side while you're standing on it, the whole thing collapses. That there's so much pressure on the top that any disturbance to the sides will result in the whole thing crumbling. If you understand that, you kind of understand the impact of progressive reform. It is putting an enormous amount of pressure on the structure of American politics and culture. But we've talked about the fact that the two main parties have been kind of resistant to progressive reform. Democrats have kind of moved in a more populist position, and it's important to remember that the populists and the progressives are kind of responding to the same problems. But ultimately, there's not going to be any definitive change unless some change comes from within or from the side. And if you understand that basic concept, you understand why Theodore Roosevelt is so important. That ultimately, the muckrakers, these progressive journalists, can provide pressure, but they can't unilaterally create the very changes that they want to see happen. For that, you have to have change coming from a different direction, from within the government itself. But the thing about Theodore Roosevelt is that it's really weird that he would be within government in the first place. So we talked about the fact that Theodore Roosevelt has this really unorthodox beginning in politics. Actually, the entire Roosevelt clan tried to encourage him just not to run, that politics was a swarthy, corrupt business. And to be honest, if you look at politics in the Gilded Age, they weren't wrong. It really could be very corrupt and very swarthy, just very sketchy. But Theodore Roosevelt, displaying the same stubbornness that he displayed in San Juan Hill, goes into politics anyway. Um, Enters the federal government as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, resigns from that position, joins the Army, and serves in the Spanish American War. And just improbably, almost, I don't want to say miraculously, but it's just one of those fluky things in war. Roosevelt becomes a war hero. One of the very few war heroes that emerge in the Spanish American War. And he becomes a war hero despite the fact that he is a complete amateur, a noob at warfare. He's never been in the military before. But he's able to take that fame, then run for the governorship of New York, which makes him a good contender for the Republican nominee for vice president. New York is a perennial battleground state in the 1890s, early 1900s, and if you remember, the Democratic Party's one successful presidential candidate, Grover Cleveland, came from New York. So when William McKinley of Ohio runs for a second term, he decides that it would be kind of nice to have New York solidly in the Republican Party's control. And so he picks Theodore Roosevelt as his vice presidential running mate. McKinley's advisor, a newspaper baron by the name of Mark Hanna, is a little skeptical about this decision. He says that this puts, quote, that damned cowboy within a heartbeat of the White House. But if you remember, throughout most of U.S. history, vice presidents don't really matter. So, in other words, if Theodore Roosevelt was a crazy cowboy, and by the way, there's ample evidence to support that conclusion, um, well, it probably wouldn't matter. McKinley was in good health. Um, up to this point, only four presidents have died in office. Two were kind of sickly and experiencing old age anyway, and the other two were assassinated due to very unique and fluky situations. Um, so I suppose that McKinley thought that it was worth the risk. But what happens, of course, is that after McKinley is reelected in 1900, going against his old nemesis William Jennings Bryan, um, McKinley decides to tour the Pan American exhibition in, I think it's Syracuse, New York. And by the way, what is being exhibited at the Pan American Exposition, you may ask? Well, Thomas Edison's new, or relatively new invention, the light bulb, where everything is covered in light bulbs. It looks kind of like a gigantic Christmas tree. But anyway, I will also provide a little bit more context and remind you guys that there is no such thing as a presidential secret service or secret service protection yet. So, in other words, you could go up to the President of the United States, you could slap him on the back, you could, rub elbows, that kind of thing. Well, anyway, um, at this exhibition, McKinley is confronted by a radical anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz. That is Leonczogolsz. And I'm not sure if you can identify the kind of the language that the last name sort of derives from, but Leon Czolgosz is a first generation immigrant from Poland, and he had fallen into sort of radical anarchist politics, which in the United States is kind of a new thing. I mean, the whole point of anarchism is that you want to resist government influence and government control. That was actually kind of a big thing in Europe where you had very powerful governments, whether you're talking about Tsarist Russia or Imperial Germany or even Republican France. These were all states with powerful centralized governments. In the United States, you don't really have much of a government to be anarchistic against to a certain extent. The federal government is still kind of weak. But what happens is that, um, and I feel guilty because this certainly should not be seen as a dig at immigrants. But the fact is that when large numbers of immigrants are coming in from Europe, they're bringing some of their political views and political ideologies with them, including anarchism, which is not something that I would say, something that we kind of see in the United States originally in the early 19th century. So it's one of the reasons why when we talk about the Haymarket strike, you have these radical anarchist groups that throw a bomb into a picket line, but these radical anarchist groups were actually mostly Germans or like first generation German immigrants. So we kind of see that there is this transatlantic connection between European and American politics. And that connection is actually strongest when we're talking about radical political groups, so socialists, anarchists. But anyway, Czolgosz decides that he wants to develop some serious anarchist street cred. And if you are militant against the government, what better way to develop that street cred than going after the most powerful government official, William McKinley? So William McKinley gets shot in the gut. Now, to McKinley's credit, McKinley tells his aides and the crowd not to beat the crap out of Czolgosz. Um, And so, actually, not only is he sort of cognizant during all of this, he seems like he is going to make a fairly comprehensive recovery. In fact, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, had contemplated going on a virile, manly vacation, climbing the Adirondack Mountains of New York. But Theodore Roosevelt says, you know what? I think I'll just put those plans on hold. McKinley's like, oh, no, no, I'm going to be totally fine. You just go ahead and have a ball. And privately, that's because McKinley and some of his close advisors want Roosevelt out of the way. They think that he just kind of complicates everything and is too sort of self-centered, which they might be right there. But anyway, Roosevelt goes and climbs the Adirondacks. And again, just like with James Garfield, what happens is that the gunshot wound does not kill McKinley. The infection that sets in after the fact does. And McKinley dies not from a bullet per se, but by the unwashed hands of doctors to a certain extent. And again, this is where I'll say that the reason why we have the development of entire religions like Christian Science in the late 19th century, why we have the widespread distribution of homeopathic remedies like snake juice, those types of things, is because medical science had not significantly advanced during the 19th century, not to a significant degree at the very least. So what happens is that McKinley dies, but awkwardly, the vice president is typically on standby, except in this case, Roosevelt is in the middle of the Adirondack Mountains. So imagine being the guy, the aide, who is tasked with going after Roosevelt, searching the Adirondack Mountains to track down one guy. Well, eventually, Roosevelt is found. He's sent on a midnight train back to Washington, D.C., and then he takes up McKinley's term. And it's worth noting, by the way, that McKinley is assassinated in 1901, which means that Roosevelt comes in within the first year of McKinley's term. So Roosevelt has a lot of, let's say, time to enact policies. And it's also worth noting that, remember, somebody like Roosevelt is creative, flamboyant, original, and politicians in the Gilded Age are not supposed to be that. So the only way Roosevelt manages to become president is in this roundabout way. It's hard to imagine that he would sweep through a nominating convention at the primary level during this time, despite the fact that you're beginning to see open primaries in some states. Anyway, Theodore Roosevelt is not only a deliciously meme-worthy president, but he's also one of those strong presidential figures, a la Andrew Jackson, a la Abraham Lincoln, even. And the thing about Roosevelt is, before we get into his progressive policies, we need to go over really what makes Roosevelt unique, and it's not really progressive reform per se. Roosevelt was just one of many progressives, but Roosevelt was very unique in the sense that he had a clear vision of what American foreign policy should be. And that in itself is kind of interesting to begin with, because most American presidents don't focus on foreign policy. Or in some cases, some American presidents actually get elected by saying they know nothing about foreign policy. I'm not sure what this says about us as a country, but that could be a surprisingly popular position, that I have no idea what's going on in the rest of the world, so you should vote for me. And to a certain extent, there are times in which that point of view is attractive. If you are if you're running against a president, for example, who is very interventionist, who is very bellicose and warlike, then maybe Americans want to hear that I know nothing about the rest of the world, and because I know nothing, I'm less likely to get involved in a war. Um, Roosevelt, though, is not only somebody who knows quite a bit about foreign policy, he's a historian. He writes a book in college at Harvard on the naval history of the War of 1812, if that tells you anything. But he's somebody who thinks of it as the most important thing ever to a certain extent. And also, what makes Roosevelt unique here is that he's the only president, I think, who praises war for its own sake. Now, of course, some presidents could be considered warlike or bellicose. Some presidents get elected because of their records in war, but no president, at least in my recollection, other than Teddy Roosevelt, praises war for its own sake. And by the way, usually the presidential generals, whether you're talking about Washington or Grant or Eisenhower, while they might enjoy some of their wartime experiences, what's kind of remarkable is whether because of conviction or because of shrewdness, they all say that war is pretty terrible in direct or roundabout ways. Roosevelt, however, is somebody who praises war for its own sake. Um, right before the war of the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt gives a speech to the Naval War College in which he makes the point that war is good, that war builds character. And he would argue, by the way, that it certainly did for him. He goes to the Spanish-American War to prove that he had the courage that everybody doubted his father had during the American Civil War. So I don't know. It's certainly kind of revealing because obviously, even in a very jingoistic era, Americans tend to be skeptical then, as well as now, of anybody who openly praises the use of force. And of course, this makes it all the more ironic that Roosevelt is very progressive, but on the other hand, he's also kind of an open imperialist. So there are two sort of consistencies in American foreign policy. There is, and you can see these consistencies in Washington's farewell address and in the Monroe Doctrine. And those policies are don't have any entangling alliances and um, keep European empires out of the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt actually puts America on the pathway of actually enforcing the Monroe Doctrine a little bit more. Historically, the Monroe Doctrine um, is kind of a passive-aggressive policy. Uh, and realistically, the Monroe Doctrine has only been enforced only on in a few basic ways. What's different about Roosevelt is that he puts forward the idea of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Corollary is spelled Corollary. Yeah, that's right. A corollary is kind of an expansion or an addendum, an amendment to. Um, the Roosevelt corollary basically states that any interference in the Western Hemisphere or Latin America will be seen as a hostile act to the United States. And you can tell that Roosevelt has this much more assertive foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere more generally in what he does in Panama. I mean, you guys read about it, hopefully, but if you remember, in Panama, uh, you have this deal between the United States and the government of Colombia to build a canal across the Panamanian Isthmus. And that's not just for economic benefit. Remember Alfred Thayer Mahan, the guy who writes the influence of sea power upon history. He writes that you got to build a canal there because The United States is a two-ocean naval power, and that means you basically have to build two navies, which is ridiculously expensive. What happens if we're attacked in the Pacific and we need our navy from the Atlantic to support it, or vice versa? Well, to do that, you have to sail all the way around the Straits of Magellan. It's not an exaggeration to say this, but you basically have to go down to Antarctica because you're only a couple hundred miles away from Antarctica if you're going through the Straits of Magellan. By the time the fleet makes its way around to the other side of the world, the war might already be over. So Roosevelt is a champion of the idea of building a canal across Panama, but the problem is that the Colombian government owns it. Well, that's no problem because ultimately Colombia and the United States signed a treaty called the Hay-Herran Treaty, which allows the United States to basically support the construction of a canal across the Panamanian Isthmus. The Colombian government, though, gets cold feet. Um, so, in other words, I mean, Donald Trump just walked away from a summit with Kim Jong Un, saying that sometimes you got to walk away from a deal. So that's kind of what Colombia does. Well, apparently Theodore Roosevelt is not as mild-mannered and easygoing as Kim Jong Un because Theodore Roosevelt decides that, darn it, he still wants his canal anyway, and he actually helps support the idea of Panamanian independence. The problem is that Panamanian independence is not really something that enjoys broad support from Panama itself. Panama is basically a province of Colombia. Well, that's no problem. Roosevelt kind of creates this Panamanian independence movement, and that Panamanian independence movement separates from Colombia. And when the Colombian government tries to reoccupy or reconquer Panama, they find a fleet of U.S. warships sitting off the coast. So Panama gets independence, and the United States builds the Panama Canal. And the 3-year-old in me still thinks that despite the fact that Roosevelt uses tactics that would make Vladimir Putin blush to get Panama, the fact is that the Panama Canal is still inherently cool. Now, that being said, I think that people who were working on it at the time might have a little more of a nuanced opinion. So, for example, um, it's 43 miles long, but over 5,000 people die to build the thing. And it also requires 78 million tons of TNT to actually fully build. Just to give you an idea, I think that the Hiroshima bomb used in World War II, the first atomic bomb, had a yield of roughly 20,000 tons of TNT. So divide 78 million by 20,000, and you get an idea of how much effort was put into building the canal. Panama actually becomes an American protectorate until basically 1999. Jimmy Carter announces in the 1970s that the United States will allow Panama to become fully independent. So a protectorate is kind of like if you think of a satellite state, or think of like a protectorate as like your younger 2 to 3 year old sibling. They're independent. They're not you. You don't officially have authority or power over them, but you kind of do. So protectorates are kind of pawns or puppet states, if you will. And by the way, that sounds very patriarchal, paternalistic, I suppose. And to some extent, that's because it is, where the United States kind of views itself as this elder sibling figure in Latin America more generally. By the way, Roosevelt also demonstrates his desire to keep European powers out in his second term. What happens is that the government of Venezuela, this is maybe a little too soon, actually, but oh God, the government of Venezuela goes bankrupt. Not saying the history repeats itself, but it kind of does. Well, At this point, I don't think that Venezuela really had a central bank, so that it couldn't really print off lots and lots of currency. Um, Now, maybe that's good for Venezuela then, because Venezuela today does have a central bank, and because it's printing a lot of money to deal with its financial problems, it's experiencing hyperinflation. But what's going on in Venezuela during the turn of the century is that it goes bankrupt, and the holders of that debt, the debt Venezuela owes, are other countries. Countries like the United States, but also Great Britain and Germany. So if you go bankrupt and you're a homeowner, well, the bank can basically come in and foreclose upon your house. What happens if countries go bankrupt? Um, there's not really a script for that. Well, unless you're Kaiser Wilhelm II, you make your own script. Just like you kind of do with everything. See, ergo, the origins of World War I, by the way, coming soon. But if you're Kaiser Wilhelm II, you don't structure a payment plan. You send Germany's brand new battle fleet down to Venezuela with the mission of extracting a payment or else. The British kind of do it too, but what's interesting is that Roosevelt, when the Europeans send their navies down to Venezuela, Roosevelt sends America's navy to challenge these other European powers as well. And that kind of signifies that the United States doesn't really see itself as this isolationist power away from European entanglements. In some respects, Roosevelt kind of sees the United States as just another European empire, albeit an empire that could potentially become even more powerful than the Europeans because it's more industrial and will eventually become more wealthy.